Hi Sue, it's a huge pleasure to have you today to discuss about this very important topic about the AI impacts on power, distribution of power, shift of power. And actually, during our preliminary preparation discussion, we really said something, one sentence that was so well framed. And I kept thinking about this, and I really wanted to start the podcast with this. That it was that AI, generative AI, should be for 8 billion people and not just 8 billionaires. And now I wanted to turn to you and let you explain to the audience what you mean by this and how do you see the AI impact on power.
Yeah, this was a phrase that I first heard some years ago from a woman called Rachel Caldicott. And she said, we need to make sure that AI benefits 8 billion people and not just 8 billionaires. And that for me was a real light bulb moment when I thought, that is why I want to get into this world of AI and data science. This is why I want to help other people understand what these tools can do, so that the potential, the opportunities they have, but also the risks. Because I'd read some time before a book by Shoshana Zuboff, which is called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And that had really made me think about data and how we're handing over so much data to big tech companies in particular, but governments and other organizations as well. Couple that with the power of artificial intelligence to make predictions, to direct our lives in certain ways. And it made me realize that really we are just putting an enormous amount of power into the hands of a tiny number of people and organizations. And that shift of power really grates with me. It makes me feel that as an individual, I am less powerful, less able to have agency over my life. And as a group of people in Western countries, we are just saying, hey, we'll just be manipulated by these tech companies. We'll do whatever it is they want. We'll buy whatever it is they put in front of us rather than having the opportunity to make more decisions. And crucially, it made me think, what about disadvantaged people, wherever they are in the world? And when you recognize that 2.6 billion people around the world are not digitally connected, not even on the internet, then you think, hang on a minute, we're designing a world, or rather, a very few, very small number of people are designing a world, which is great for them. And it will give some goods, some benefit to many of the rest of the world, but it's not being designed to do that. It's been designed to transfer power and transfer money to that tiny number of people and organizations. And I just thought, well, what can I do? What can I learn? What information can I give to other people that helps them keep some of that power and question and push back against this rather than just saying, yeah, do whatever you want. I'm sure you know what's best for me. So that was my motivation. And I did a master's degree in MSc in AI and data science back in 2020 because I recognized I didn't know about this technology and I wanted to learn more, and then set up the company, which is called AI Governance, which has a specific mission to inspire as many people as possible to use AI with wisdom and integrity. So the first stage there is helping people understand what AI is and what it can do, what the risks are. And then the second level is helping them think through the philosophy, if you like, about what they could do, how they're going to make those choices, and the impact those choices have on wider society. So yeah, that's the motivation. It's a big mission. I can't do it alone. So having opportunities to talk to you and your audience is fantastic because hopefully that gets a few more people thinking, what can I do? What can my part in this mission be as well?
What is always important is you already pointed to the fact that AI is a very large world and you have generative AI. And for many people, AI means ChatGPT these days, but you have way more application, or arguably more application and older application in the business world, including in the business world, where AI is mainly used, for example, for prediction, as you said. It could be in banking, could be in medical sectors. And these are vastly different tools with different implications. And now, indeed, I mean, the thing is with Gen AI, it's really something that anyone without technical knowledge can use in their daily
Mm.
life. So that's also why people are more exposed and see this nowadays. But I'm just curious, before going into the macro big picture, actually, do you use AI, generative AI, often? And what are typically the action you take to prevent sharing too much information with big private companies concentrated in one part of the world?
Yeah, so I was doing a session yesterday with a lot of small to medium-sized business leaders, and one of the questions that kept coming up is, tell me what specific tool I should be using. Give me one magic bullet that I should have in my organization. And of course, the answer is there isn't one magic bullet. It depends how your data's organized, depends what you're trying to achieve. So the conversation with them was about being curious, maintaining your curiosity and trying different tools. And so that's naturally what I do in my work as well. I will constantly be shifting, trying different tools, thinking about what they might be useful for. And it is sometimes very seductive. When something crops up. And I was using a tool the other day, a mind mapping tool. When I last used it, probably back end of last year, it didn't have much AI functionality built in. I used it again this week, and all of a sudden, wow, there's AI functionality all over it, and it was doing amazing things, and it was making my life easier. It was really being a very quick way that I could get to what I needed to get to. So it's seductive, isn't it? We get sucked into using these things because we say, wow, that is it's just making my life so easy. So the temptation there is to, in that case of a mind mapping tool, or it might be something that synthesizes information from various different data sources when I want to write a report, pulling 50 different things together. It's very seductive to say, well, I'll just upload everything. But of course, we have to take that step back all the time and say, how does this particular tool work? Is it okay for me to upload everything into this particular tool? And again, at the session with small business leaders yesterday, they were saying, which ones are safe to use and which ones aren't. Again, there isn't a simple answer. It depends. And I might tell somebody that a particular tool will not extract their data, will not use it to train that tool further in the future. That might be correct today, but that company might change the way it works tomorrow. And so that information could then be false tomorrow when they've decided, oh no, we will actually suck in the uploads and the prompts that you give us and use that for training. So this is where it's really complicated because of the lack of rules around the world, lack of regulation and legislation. There is a very much this feeling of a wild west that the individual tool maker, the individual model maker in the AI world can make up their own rules. And we might trust some of those organizations more than others because some have said they're overtly trying to think about risks and safety of AI. Others have said, hey, just trust us to do the right thing. But again, we can't actually know what is going to be in our best interests, short term or long term. So it's a very complicated thing. So to answer your question, what do I do?
Mhm.
I tend to edit things down. So if I want to, in the case of that mind mapping tool, if I want to do something to do a mind map, I will not tell it exactly what it is I'm trying to achieve. I'll keep the confidential things that are sensitive to my organization back and give it enough that's generic so that wouldn't matter if it was used for training in the future. In other words, I'm skeptical. Always curious, trying out new tools, but always being skeptical and assuming at some point in the future they will use my prompt, my data for some purposes that I don't like. So I keep anything that's particularly confidential out of it, which inevitably means I don't perhaps get the best out of the tool. But it's that balance, isn't it, between giving them everything and retaining something and some control.
And I have also this kind of skeptical mindset. I don't know if it's because I was a trained economist and I see the world in such a way sometimes that's basically profit maximization from many people at all costs. But typically, when I do trainings about how to use Gen AI in sensitive industries. Sometimes I have the following saying, and I'm curious what you think about. But you have this functionality. For example, you go on ChatGPT and you have the temporary chat, and it's written basically they won't keep anything. And the thing is, I don't really trust big tech companies in the US to respect privacy because they have shown in the past that it's at the core of their business to extract all this information. And if anything, if I was ill with ill intentions, these chats where it's temporary chats is probably where you have the most valuable information that people want to hide. So I just tend to say,
Yeah.
well, be very careful. Indeed, regulation can change over time, but even current regulation in some situations, we have to be careful because it's sometimes not so clear what do they mean by use for training, not for training, for quality assessment. And you have Copilot. I
Yeah.
don't know what you think about, and you have read basically their Microsoft Copilot because it's at the core of their business, right? And you have this small like shield you can click and see what do they do to protect the data. What do you think typically about this tool? with respect to privacy.
Yeah, there's Copilot, and I think also about Google Gemini, which I tend to use more than ChatGPT. Again, you can change your settings in your Google account to make it so that they're not training on the prompts that you put in. But again, I'm really wary about these things because a person might use one device, their work PC or laptop, for example, and have the settings set up for one level of security, and then they're commuting home and they're doing a bit more work and they're using a different device with a different login, and they don't remember that hasn't got the same security settings. So for me, no matter what the organization says about their settings and their security and level of use of your data for training, I just think it's a dangerous world to be in, to try and say that every individual has to remember to use the right settings on the right device all the time. And we won't. And when you think back to some of the horrible things that have happened and are still happening around cybersecurity, what's the missing link or what's the weak link all the time? It's us, it's humans, isn't it? So this world that we're devising at the moment with LLMs in particular, they're not set up first and foremost for our security, for the security of our data. And because of that, I think us humans are weak and fallible, and we will make some awful mistakes. We've seen a few in the past that haven't led to anything too disastrous, but the more that we, again, shift power and rely on these tools, the more I think that as the human element, we will be making some mistakes. So again, for me, I would love to see some of the big tech companies stepping up and saying, we're going to go further. We're going to do more to protect you, the individual, soft, carbon built human creature, from doing the inevitable wrong things that we know you're going to do. But we're not seeing that. So yes, in a sense, Microsoft has put data security quite high on the list, but I don't think they've put the human fallibility high enough onto that as well. It's still down to us to do the right thing, and we won't. We'll make mistakes. We've seen that so much with cybersecurity. So yes, I'm still pushing to go further on that.
And when you said this important point about changing devices and having different rules and how you can forget, it also made me realize that now you have AI integration everywhere. I can just go on Zoom here and click AI Companion. And basically, maybe you're very careful with your main tool, Google Gemini, or it could be ChatGPT, where you really know that you're talking to an AI. But also you have all this integration everywhere where you start, and I'm thinking about my own usage, where maybe when I code on Google Colab and have Gemini to help me, I may be less careful about the information, the code I put in, the many things. And
Yeah.
sometimes also with the amount of information we share and the sheer capacity of these tools to, and LLMs, I mean, to extrapolate and connect dots, it's also sometimes not clear the
Yeah.
extent of the information that not only we shared, but that can be inferred. And for example,
Absolutely.
you see with ChatGPT o3, who is it's almost scary how good it is. You take a picture and you in the street and you ask, okay, can you find where is this place? And
Yep.
sometimes it's crazy. They will look at the cut some part of the pictures, look so automatically, or yeah, and basically look at if you have mountain range that the tool can recognize. The other day I did this in my garden, and there was some construction works further, and you have like these. There was some mobile phone number of the company on some truck, and basically it looked for the mobile phone, looked on the internet, localized the company, said, okay, it's in Switzerland, in this area, so the company should work in maybe an area of 30 kilometers. I recognize this type of architecture. And it was very scary, to be honest,
Yeah.
just
Yeah,
with
no, no,
one
that's a really
picture.
good point, that we're using the tools in so many different, particularly at work, in so many different ways, aren't we? And it just pops up on your, it could be a human resource system or a finance and accounting package. And oh, look, there's an AI tool. And the individual user doesn't have the time to be going away and saying, well, how does this particular tool work? So what we're doing, tend to do in organizations, is we train people with some blanket piece of training, which may just be about how they use Copilot or how they use ChatGPT. And we're not giving them the training on how to use this AI helper button in all the other different software that we're bringing in. And fundamentally, I've seen it so many times that the procurement people aren't being taught how to ask the right questions when they're buying in these third-party tools as well. And one example I came across a little while ago now was a company that in financial services, and they needed to procure a new telephone call handling system. And in the UK, the regulator specifies about how you must record telephone calls so that if there's a problem later, those calls can be played back. So, there was a lot about this of technology. And the company went out, they procured a new phone system, they installed the system. A month after it went live, a warning flashed up on the screen of one of the supervisors saying that a call handler had been abusing a customer. And they thought, oh, well, that's not the way we behave. We're not that sort of company. So the supervisor and the call handler had a conversation. And the call handler said, oh, well, no, that conversation, that phone call was with Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith is profoundly deaf. So I was raising my voice to be heard and understood by him. And he was raising his voice because that's how he always speaks on the phone. So no abuse of the customer, fine. But why did the system think there was? Artificial intelligence, of course. It had sentiment analysis built in, which was analysing the words and the tone of voice being used and came up with a prediction that this particular call was abusing the customer. So then the interesting thing was, hang on, in all the process of procuring the new phone system, was the company ever told that this was built in? No. So a
Mm,
system, an artificial
I see.
intelligence system built in by a third party, it was switched on by default, and the customer, the financial services business, was never told through the whole of the procurement process that this system was there and it was artificial intelligence. So I've lobbied the UK government to say to them, we should have it as a basic minimum that third-party tool suppliers have to tell us what is built in terms of AI, what is built into their AI, their systems, so transparency and explainability, how that actually works. And coupled with that, it should be switched off by default. So unless we as the purchasing organization want it switched on, it isn't switched on. And that gives us the opportunity then to train our people to say, we're going live next Tuesday with this system. It's got artificial intelligence built into it. This is what it does. And these are the parameters it's been trained on. So we've tested it and we know that it's appropriate to our particular situation rather than it's been trained on some other set of data and it doesn't actually work for us. So there's so much there to unpack. But again, it's the power, isn't it? About shifting the power to say we trust these organizations who are supplying our third party tools and they'll somehow magically know what's right for us. So one of the things I'd really like to make progress on in the next year is to help people who are in procurement understand what questions to ask, understand what the answers mean that they get back. Because I can't tell you how many times I've been using a third party tool and I've said to them, how is your model trained? What is the algorithm it's using? What does it do? What's the data set it's been trained on? People selling the tool can't answer my questions. So 9 times out of 10, I will not go ahead and buy that tool because I want to know how it works before I start using it on my systems.
Yeah, now it's really everywhere. So indeed, you really need and for the trust of the process, the clients, anyone, the users, you
Mm,
really need to be very clear. This is AI. This is not. The other
yes.
day it was really interesting because I just asked in my accounting app. I just asked there was this small chat button, and I was sure it was a chatbot. So I asked a quick question, and then I was like, oh, sorry, you're really a human. So it was
Oh,
nothing like it just because I asked a kind of trivial question shortly, and I thought, oh, if I knew you were a human, I would put more form or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
It was funny because sometimes it just revealed that it's everywhere. I'm used to work with AI. I expected this kind of functionality with someone who will answer directly to be
Mm,
some kind of chatbot, and
yeah,
it wasn't. But uh,
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
but
but again,
indeed,
that's the transparency piece, isn't it? It would be very easy for them to have just that little, little sign on the bot when you start to interact with it that says you're dealing with Fred, who is a human,
yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
you're dealing with Fred, who is an AI bot.
Mhm.
But why don't people give us that level of transparency? It's not difficult to do, and then yes, it does alter the quality of the relationships that we have with them and the way we use the tools. So more transparency is one of the fundamental things that we teach when we teach companies about what responsible AI is and what good governance looks like. Transparency. It's hard for organizations to get their heads around. And one of my clients is an energy business. And we did some work last year looking at what guidance to give their communications team in how they're using AI. And crucially, when do they tell people that, for example, an image in a marketing brochure is AI generated or not? And it was a good debate and a discussion because we said, well, for years, they've been using tools to manipulate photos, for example, Photoshop type tools. And they haven't bothered telling anybody that they were changing those images then. Okay. But at what point do you say, well, this has gone too far and we should tell people that this is a very artificial image as opposed to just something that's been a little bit tweaked by Photoshop? So it's philosophy, isn't it? And we're not used to philosophizing in our organizations. We're used to just go, right, what are the rules? I'm going to abide by the rules and not actually try to use my brain to think through these implications. And again, then it comes to the power of who in the organization has the power to do that philosophizing. Whose responsibility is it to take on board AI ethics and consider the ethical implications of different things that we might do? Who makes those choices? And again, in my teaching, we always say to people, it shouldn't be down to one person. Too often I see somebody like maybe a general counsel, the top legal person in an organization, who's had this put onto their desk because typically the chief executive is saying that they don't want to be doing it. So they're saying, oh, who else could do it? Oh, you over there. Suddenly you're the person responsible for AI ethics. And these people are going, I've never talked about this before. I've had no training in it. It's suddenly landed on my desk. What do I do? And the key message to them always is, it's not just you. It can't be just you. You need to get a cross-functional
Mhm.
team of people together and have these discussions and train people so that they are well equipped to debate and discuss and come up with answers. And crucially, you've got to have a culture in the organization that says this isn't about perfection. Ethics can't be. Ethics is about gray areas. And sometimes a
Mhm.
group of people might make a choice about how they're going to use an AI tool. And with hindsight, 6 months later, 12 months later, their decision doesn't look so good. But we can't punish them for that. So long as they've been through a process and had a rational discussion and reasoning of why they came up to coming up with the decision they did, we can't then criticize them too much if they made a decision slightly on the wrong area of that grey spectrum, which we can only know about some point in the future.
So one of the last episode I published was about ethics, and I think that it's indeed a very central topic. And the person just also shared that sometimes you have this ethics committee in the companies, but they
Mm.
don't have the power, and you need them to be able, right? It's and else it's maybe ethics washing. I don't know how you call this, but I guess what's your experience with this? Do you have seen different shape and form of this ethics committee with the capacity to intervene? Yeah.
Yes, yes, and I've seen them changing over time as well. We have a responsible AI summit in London every year. It's coming up in September, and it's been really interesting watching how things have changed over time. So the first one that we held was in 2022. Yes, I think that's right. And then, pretty early days of people having ethics committees and talking about it. And then they would be quite cumbersome. This committee would meet for 2 hours once a month. And the idea was that all the AI use cases that were being considered in the company would come into this committee at a certain point before they could go further in their development. And that works fine if you've only got one or two. But this particular organization I'm thinking of was quite a big organization. Once we got into 2023, large language models, they were suddenly getting so many more use cases coming through that they just couldn't keep up with them. So the committee meeting once a month, discussing one or two use cases, was being overwhelmed because there was so much coming through. So of course, human nature, humans being what they are, what did people do? Well, they started to say, oh, I won't put my use case into the ethics committee just yet. I'll carry on working on it. And then, of course, by the time it got to going into the ethics committee, there was so much maybe real capital or certainly emotional capital invested in making this thing go forward that they did not want the ethics committee to veto it or try and change it in any way. So what this particular company did then was say, okay, this isn't working. It's a bottleneck and people are finding their ways around it. So what we'll do is have diffuse responsibility for
Mhm.
AI ethics across different parts of the business, which got rid of the bottleneck, but then it introduced a different risk. And that risk, of course, is inconsistency. So different groups of people, although they're all trained to do the same thing and work in the same way, inevitably those groups would come up with some different decisions. So it's about working with the imperfect. And I think quite often that's difficult for leaders in organizations because you're taught to always go for best practice and the state of the art, and trying to be leaders in absolutely everything. And we get quite uncomfortable when we have to deal with grey areas where we're just not sure what the best thing to do is. So that's one of the main teachings I work with leaders on, is how do you change the culture of your organization so that it accepts that things aren't always perfect, and we don't then go and punish people if they do come up with imperfect decisions in the cold light of reflection months or years later.
Yeah, and as you showed here, also it depends the counterfactual. So you can have the perfect setup where all the decisions have the same standard are made, but then it's probably technically impossible due to the number of projects. So it's again, what's the counterfactual? Well, it's better done than just not done, because you want perfection. But at least here, this diffusion, even if it creates some heterogeneity, at least you know that there is someone with a similar training at the beginning
Mm.
who is tracking the change and what is happening in all these small projects before it goes wild and live. And
Yeah.
and probably, I guess, you also have at some point in the year, even if it's not all the time, like committees where they just cross
Oversight.
check.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, having review and so on. Yeah, and it's certainly better to do that than not. I mean, there's the example of Uber, who were not in the UK, not in the EU because of the GDPR regulations, but in some parts of the world, they were sacking drivers just by removing them from the Uber driver app. And so the driver would suddenly go, "Oh, I'm not on the app anymore. Why is that?" And they didn't have any recourse to find out what was going on. It was an algorithmic decision, and somebody in Uber had made the decision that that was a good and efficient way to work, to just have people suddenly not on the app because they hadn't fulfilled a certain number of obligations, and the algorithm had said, "Yeah, we don't want you as a driver anymore." So, it's a human made that decision. And compare and contrast that with the instance from Xerox, the business machine manufacturer. They wanted to reduce their attrition rates in one part of the United States. So the amount of people leaving the company within 6 months of joining. And they recognized, having looked at the data, that people who lived further away from this particular site were more likely to leave within 6 months. So they said, right, we can do a nice little algorithm that when we're looking at people's CVs, when they're applying to join us, we can exclude those that live further away than a certain distance. And then that's going to cut our attrition rate. Brilliant. Nice mathematical solution to the problem. But one clever person in the organization said, hang on a minute, that we're in quite an affluent area here. People who live further away tend to be living in less affluent areas. We actually want to give those people in less affluent areas the opportunity to come and work for us to improve their life chances. So no, let's not exclude them in this algorithmic method, because that actually goes against the culture that we're trying to create in the company. So that was a really good example of where the maths gives you one nice, easy answer, but the human intuition, the human insights and ethics gives you a very different answer. So we must always have enough people around the table who've got different life experiences, different way of looking at things, to come up with those different viewpoints rather than just going with the easy mathematical option.
Hmm. And this happens. So this setting of KPIs and metrics is central. It's also part of my obsession working with data. But humans are imperfect with this. We know that you have this rule where basically the KPI becomes the only goal. It's not a good goal anymore.
Mm.
And it's interesting because you have many examples with AI also where, but similarly to humans, honestly, it's when you set these goals. For example, you have to play this game, and this is your score, and you achieve the score by doing this. And you have some cases where AI will cheat. Basically,
Mm.
will find pathways to increase the score that humans were will say this is cheating, but actually it was not in the rules. It's just the rules were not well defined. It's I always find this interesting because people will see it as a real danger with AI, but usually it's here. It's not that they try actively to cheat. There are no concepts, at least mainly in these simple models to play games
Yeah.
of what's correct, what's not correct. It's just the rules were ill defined.
That's it, isn't it? And as humans, sometimes we don't need the rules to be so well defined because we've got all the social biases, the inculcations that we've grown up with, which mean we've already refined it down to the thing that most people would expect us to do. But the machines, as we, the famous AlphaGo scenario, where it just comes up with a move that the human would never have thought of. Well, yes, because nothing has told it that it shouldn't. And it takes me back to my childhood. I think I had a very strange childhood in lots of ways, but a very fortunate childhood in lots of ways as well, because I was never told you can't do a particular type of job or activity because you're a girl. I was just really lucky that people that were around me, the adults around in my world, didn't have that philosophy that says girls can't do X. So it meant I had, unbounded choices as far as I knew it. Whereas, other people growing up same time as me, same sort of environment as me, were in a world that said, oh no, girls can't do certain types of jobs. And that altered their life chances. So yeah, we as humans can be very self-limiting. That's one thing, that perhaps a positive thing that we can learn from the tools and the machines, how to be less self-limiting. But then, of course, we see people using that for bad purposes, don't we? And it always surprises audiences when I'm talking to them about the opportunities to use AI and the different tools that we have available. When I'll say to them, yes, you've all heard of ChatGPT, but did you know there's a fraud GPT? So if you're one of the bad guys that wants some help to make it easier for you to devise really effective phishing emails or inject poisonous data into somebody else's system, then there's a tool out there that's going to help you do it. So for every good purpose that we come up with these tools, there's somebody out there who's trying to think of a way to manipulate things and use that capacity that they have to go off the rails and do things that our society doesn't approve of. There's somebody out there that's trying to think of ways to tune them to do exactly that if it's for their gain. So again, it all points to the need for regulation, control. But we've got, back to the subject we were talking about, the big tech companies are fighting fiercely against regulation because they see anything that might perhaps help help control those bad operators, the people who want to use AI for bad practice, as having an impact on them as well, and they don't want that impact, so they are very much pushing against it, which yeah, it's not giving us a happy situation with many of these tools. So we have to keep fighting for some better regulation to come in the end.
Yeah, when you mentioned the ethics committee in companies, I directly thought, well, one type of company who should have this type of ethics committee should be the creators of LLMs and
Yeah,
to reflect before pushing things into production and giving it to the world as a natural experiment of what will
yeah,
happen. You see the tools created by Grok basically released these days, and you're like, how come you have these things live that millions of people would be exposed? It's really what can go right. I mean, it's it's so obvious that it seems that it won't go right. So yeah,
yeah.
it's very
Yeah,
peculiar.
but they have. I mean, this is again a frustration that we've seen. Meta, OpenAI, and many of the big tech companies have an ethics committee, an AI ethics committee, which
Mhm.
has looked at what they're doing with models, which has looked at the opportunities for bad actors to use them, and so on. But when these committees come up with recommendations to the board that the board doesn't like, rather than thinking, why don't we like that? How are we coming up with such different conclusions compared to our ethics committee? Too often, what they're doing is sacking the ethics committee. So they said, right, you're not coming up with things we like, so it must be you that's wrong. Bang, you're out. We close you down. And that's really frustrating. Rather than using that as an opportunity to be more reflective and say, okay, why are we at odds with that group, and how can we find a middle ground? They just say, no, we know best. We're the board. We've got the power, so we scrap you. So really, really frustrating on that. And it comes back to this whole thing about AI for good. And I was in Geneva last week with the United Nations AI for Good summit. We were talking there about the trying to get the systems so that they would be more beneficial for humans, and what we can do to do that. So you might think about discussions about regulation. There was certainly some of that going on. We're certainly trying to influence those big tech companies so that they want to be on the right side of this debate rather than on the wrong side of history. But there is no global consensus around this, and it's really quite frustrating. So you've got organizations like the United Nations that have done great work in the past, for example, on interoperability of mobile phones. If it wasn't for the work that they've done, we might buy a phone in one country and it wouldn't work in another country. So there's been great work done behind the scenes, but you have to have that desire for different governments to collaborate and cooperate. And where we are at the moment, some of the big nations, the United States certainly is not wanting regulation of its AI commercial marketplace. The UK, the same. We've got the EU AI Act, which is very detailed, very prescriptive, and some of it we can see perhaps won't work terribly well in the future. And then you've got China, which again has been very controlled and very prescriptive, but actually, interestingly, is leading to quite a thriving AI market there because they've backed and supported the creation of different types of technology, air taxis, for example, autonomous air taxis being one. And I can see the Chinese marketplace and Chinese businesses really doing very well in the next few years because they've got some regulatory certainty, which we don't have in many other parts of the world, and they've got the ability to get investment capital, and they've got the talent pool to develop new ways of using AI. So I think there's going to be a big battle, again, back to power, over the next few years between companies and organizations in China where they really are pushing forward within a confined regulatory framework, but a very clear regulatory framework, and then organizations in America where they have very little in the way of regulatory frameworks. They can get their hands on capital, but it's less certain what might happen in the future. So yeah, that China-US battle is already taking place, and definitely saw that at the UN summit where there were so many more people from Chinese companies that were exhibiting there, Chinese researchers talking about their work, and people from not just China but other areas around Asia who are really influencing the global scene and the global regulatory setting as well. So a big battle that has already commenced for power there.
And the fact that you bring regulations and China made me think directly to also the fact that sometimes regulation are only seen economically as something maybe bad in some cases, but it's not the case. I mean, if you think about the story of DeepSeek, it all comes back to the regulation, right? It basically you have this barrier limitation to sense the top GPUs in China. So you limit the capacity to have this to brute force the solution, and they came up
Yeah,
with a more efficient way, reaching the
yeah,
same level of quality with R1, DeepSeek R1, and others.
yeah,
But it helped them to innovate and find a way. Well, we don't have the best GPUs, but we'll just optimize to the
yeah,
best we can the computation and do the same with less. And I
yeah.
guess it's a good sign also that sometimes with this regulation it just leads to innovations and could lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this sort of old saw that, regulation is the enemy of innovation. Well, exactly that example proves that the two can go hand in hand. You don't necessarily want very, very tight regulation that tries to prescribe everything, but giving some guidelines, giving some bounds, and giving more the energy, the motivation to compete and to change and to do something that makes the world go wow is huge. So I think there is a place for some more regulation in the AI space, definitely on things like copyright right and intellectual property, for example. I'm
Mhm.
quite horrified by the UK government's attitude on this. They are very much pushing the copyright owners, so the individual creative person or an individual creative company, to be the ones that have to find out where their material is being used and then opt out if they don't like it. Well, for me, that's the wrong way around. The developers of tools have so much more power, again, and technical ability to be able to figure out how to remunerate the individual artist or copyright owners. So why aren't we saying to the tech companies, you're the ones who have that ability. You should have the duty to figure out where people are, that whose assets you want to use, and how you're going to remunerate them. For me, that's blindingly obvious, but the UK government are looking like they're veering towards the opposite and putting the emphasis on the artists and copyright owners, which I can't see that working at all. But we're waiting to see what regulations come forward after the government's consultation on this one, and all the indications are they're going to put the power in the wrong hands. So very frustrating again.
Yeah, and this strategy is also very inefficient because first it's very hard to understand. They know if they trained on your material, while for you to guess it's complicated. And the other thing is that machine unlearning is a huge topic and it's a very
Mm,
tough topic. Like once it's in the machine, basically it has been learned. It's very hard to know in which weight within trillions of weights sometimes
yeah.
is the information captured and how can you remove this? It's a very technical and complex topic. Uh,
Absolutely, and the as you've just demonstrated with the DeepSeek example, if we put the emphasis on the tech companies to come up with clever solutions, they will find a way. But if I'm an artist or a photographer or a musician, how am I supposed to come up with technical solutions? It's not my wheelhouse. So let's put the responsibility in the wheelhouse of those who've got the ability to solve it. Again, for me, it's blindingly obvious. But when you're supposed faced with millions and millions of euros or pounds or dollars worth of lobbying from big tech companies, perhaps that means you see it differently. I'm a
mhm.
cynic. Mm.
But yeah, so indeed, if we talk about power, you mentioned the fact that sometimes ethic committees that exist actually in these big OpenAI and other companies, but we also see at least from my seats that these companies are led with very charismatic, almost autocratic leaders that seems
Right.
to do whatever they want,
Mm.
and not only within their company, but we see this proximity now, concentration geographically of these leaders in the US, and proximity with the politics. And again, if we think about the concentration of power and the impact it has on the world, because hundreds of millions, I guess more, are using AI today, generative AI, it leads to real threats
Mm.
to basically society, democracy, and all these important things we have. And I guess when you went
Yeah.
to AI for Good, were there any people from these top big generative AI companies or not so much?
Yeah, so there was the AI for Good Summit, and then also in June, I was in California with the Center for Human Compatible AI's annual summer workshop. And the thing about both of those is that, yes, we have some people there who are amazing researchers doing incredible work thinking about AI safety, thinking about regulation. And I remember particularly talking to one young machine learning modeler who was finding really interesting ways to use maths to unpick the black box, to unpick these deep learning
Mhm.
models and make them more explainable and help them inevitably, hopefully, be safer in the way they were working, less able to be pushed into doing things that we don't particularly want them to do. And so, yeah, we do have people from big tech companies that are being sponsored, who are actually working directly for those companies or whose research is being sponsored, but not all the big tech companies are doing that equally. So, Anthropic, for example, has a really good reputation for employing researchers in this field and backing research done outside their own organization as well. I didn't see so many, I have to be honest, from OpenAI. So there's a definite difference between the two organizations there. But what I also remember when I'm at these various different events and workshops and conferences is we're in a bubble. We are there with the people who think, hey, this stuff could be dangerous. We need to protect the long-term safety of the human race. And that's why we do what we do. But there's a lot of people who aren't there, who don't want to be there. So that's the crucial thing for me, is how to influence those people. So in California, we had a whole session looking at different ways to raise the profile of some of these potential risks and get people talking about them. So not just the sort of, what if we get to artificial super intelligence and it takes over the world and destroys the humans? There was some discussion about that, but the more prosaic things, the more day-to-day things we need to be thinking of now. The fact that the technology we have today can be used to go into war zones, and an autonomous weapon can be created just by strapping a regular weapon onto the back of a Boston Consulting robot and sending it in and saying, hey, if you spot anybody that looks like this, however that's defined, they're a bad person, so shoot them. So we can have that level of autonomous weapons today. And where's the debate? Where's the discussion going on that says, actually, do we want that in our society? How do we regulate it? How do we control it? Or indeed ban it completely? So that's always my frustration, that we can have these debates and discussions, but it's a coalition of people who already think like that are in the room. And we need to do more work to influence the people who think differently and who are not in the room.
Hmm. And do you think regulatory uh, organization will manage to enforce something at the world scale, as based on your recent experience, and push for regulation on these big tech companies who seem unstoppable these days?
Yeah, I'm certainly not seeing it at the moment. So it does need that global viewpoint, and it particularly needs America and China to want to come to the table and set the tone, which then pushes everybody else around the world to come to the table and start having the dialogue as well. And under the current American administration, it's just not something that they particularly want to do, which is very frustrating because they can be great leaders, hugely influential. So I would, yeah, I mean, we've got another, almost 4 years of this particular administration. So one would hope in the next 4 years that they do think, okay, we can have power, we can have innovation, we can have growth, but we need to constrain it in certain ways. My fear is that it'll take something really dramatic and negative to happen before they step up to the plate on that. Yeah, and that means basically some disaster has happened to a group of people somewhere in the world before we see that happen. So it's the Manhattan Project all over again, isn't it? It's the consensus about nuclear weapons. You have to have something awful happening in Hiroshima and Nagasaki before people come to the table and make a global agreement. So that's awful, isn't it? To think that we have to just
Hmm.
wait for that negativity to occur before we get the action when there's so many people around the world who are already begging and pleading for the positive action to take place in advance of the negative.
And the current combination with the administration in the US is indeed particularly worrying, to say the
Yeah,
least. And
yeah.
and I guess these tools can already have an impact again on democracy, shifting the narrative in some direction. I mean, it's in very pervasive way, because I mean it's on your daily usage. You could tweak in several ways these tools, from the selection of the training set to instruction in the system prompt to different things, to just
Mm,
slightly move the opinion in one direction or the other. But at this scale,
mm.
small
Yeah.
changes and small shift can have dramatic consequences.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, that brings on the discussion about the environmental impacts and other social impacts of using these tools. And again, when I'm doing my sessions with business leaders, helping them think about the pros and cons, think about the risks of using all different types of AI, not just LLMs, but traditional machine learning, other types of deep learning, and they're generally very interested to know and to understand about the environmental impacts, for example, as well as other social impacts. And on the social side, we had an example fairly recently in the UK of somebody who was recruited into part of the civil service. So you'd expect an organization that's thought through lots of the social consequences. But this person was recruited in on the basis of 6 computer vision interviews. So interviews like this with a computer, never met a human or had a discussion with a human through the whole process of being interviewed. So he was offered the job after 6 of these interviews. And you think, well, hang on a minute, that's shifted a huge amount of power away from the individual job applicant to the employer, because that person, the job applicant, has never had the chance to find out who they'd be working with, to understand what the culture is they'd be working with, and basically to ask themselves, do I want to work here? It's simply been assumed, well, of course you'll work here if we offer you the job. Again, that's shifting of power. So somebody in the, or a whole series of people in the UK civil service have not thought through the consequences of what they're doing there. And again, with companies, when we're talking about environmental impacts, we want to know the facts. Companies will say to me again and again, tell me exactly what energy, what water usage to cool the data centers is involved of their use of a particular AI tool. And I have to say to them again and again, the companies, particularly the LLM creators, are not telling us what energy it took to create their model, what energy it takes for you to use it. And we had Sam Altman the other week saying, oh, it's only a teaspoon of water to cool a data center every time you do a prompt on ChatGPT. And you think, how disingenuous is that? You're not telling me about the energy and water impacts of building the model, and you're not telling me excuse me, about the impacts of all the teaspoons of water of all the
Exactly.
people who are using these tools every minute of every day. So we can reduce things into, and I've done it myself. I used to be in government relations, so I know how it works to reduce things so that they look palatable and look acceptable. But really, I guess I'm hoping expecting, wanting more moral responsibility from these big tech leaders. They have so much power and they could step up and use that for good and still be incredibly rich and still be incredibly powerful. But just give a little bit back to that individual job applicant rather than having 6 online interviews. Give a little bit more power to us as consumers of their tech products by telling us more about the energy usage and the water effects of that. So, share a little bit of your power, I guess, is my main message, rather than thinking they have to keep everything to themselves all the time.
And how would you see what could the world do to change this distribution of power? For example, is it about building cutting edge LLM model if we focus on Gen AI within Europe with following the regulation? Is it subsidizing or providing money to funding grants to research institutions, to things that will be open source, open weight? I know that there is currently, I don't know all the details, but promises for a new model out of EPFL, which is my next door where I teach also, but it's a top school in engineering school in Switzerland, to have this open weights, open source model. What do you think could help to stop having this such a concentration of power?
I guess so there's two things that we've traditionally seen that can change power. One is regulation and one is competition.
Mm.
So regulation, there's so much effort being put into fighting regulation that I'm not optimistic that we'll get any sort of global agreement, for example, as we've said, anytime soon, that helps to frame the social and environmental impacts and help organizations make some better decisions about their impacts. So then we're left with competition. And I guess I'm more optimistic there that there will be people and organizations that come up with different ways of operating, which shake the big tech companies to their foundations, one might hope, and make them go rather like that deep seat moment where they suddenly realize, wow, we don't have to do it the way that we've all been doing it. There is another way. So I'm hoping that there will be examples that come through, whether that is open source, whether that is a different type of technology, different algorithms, different uses of data that do shake up the big tech companies and make them realize there are competitors out there that are trying to do AI for good and are able to make money out of it and potentially then can steal the marketplace of those big pure commercial tech plays, because a lot of people, I would hope, I'm an optimist, a lot of people will say, okay, I can get the results I'm looking for if I use this new model that's come along, and it's going to be better for people and planet. Wow, what a combination that would be. So that's what I'm looking for with organizations. And I do see a lot of that in some of these, particularly the young researchers in tech who are looking at AI safety, who are really interested in the implications of it. I am hugely optimistic that some of them will band together and they'll come up with different technical solutions. And as I say, that will shake the current big tech companies to their foundations when they realize, oh, okay, there's a different way of getting the job done, and it is better for all of us. So yeah, I'm a skeptic, but I'm also an optimist.
And is it one thing you have seen going in this direction, going several years at this summit in Geneva? You said before we start recording that you witnessed an evolution. It was an interesting evolution in this AI for Good summit. And what's this
Mm.
evolution? And do you see it exactly going in this direction instead of necessarily focus on regulation, more competition?
Yeah, well, that's yes, it's a good observation. I think that whereas when I went to the summit 2 years ago in person, it was a lot smaller. We didn't have so many representatives there from Asian companies and countries, and from China in particular. This year, 2025, much bigger summit. It was in the main conference hall just by the airport in Geneva. And there, the whole area is devoted to technology coming from Chinese companies, Chinese developers. And for example, a really interesting demonstration from a Chinese business that's listed on the NASDAQ. So interesting combination there of where the investment's coming from and where the regulatory framework is. And they are demonstrating autonomous air taxis. So they've got a whole fleet of these things flying in certain parts of China, and experimenting with them as vehicles to get you from A to B. I think the range was something like 30 kilometers, so it's not huge, but as an air taxi getting you from the airport to where you need to be downtown, for example, yeah, you can see that working. And it contrasted for me with that in the UK, for example, the layers of bureaucracy that we have here that would make it impossible to be experimenting with air taxis in the same way in this very heavy regulated environment. So in China, if they want air taxis to happen, they will happen. And then from there, perhaps spread around the world. So I think there's that interesting combination that I saw there of people working in a framework, so they understand the framework better. They can get their hands on capital, not just from China, but other parts of the world as well. And they can be more innovative. So that's that ideal combination: some regulation, some freedom, some capital, of course, mixed in with it, and then bringing things forward. And I do quite often do an interesting test when I'm doing my board development or business sessions. And I ask people, yes or no, would you get into a self-driving taxi? So not an air taxi, not layering on that level of complexity, but just a straightforward ground-based one. And you get around these days 50%, 60%
Mm.
saying yes, they would try it, which is a big change from a couple of years ago. And when I was in San Francisco last month, I tried it. I got the Waymo app and I summoned up my Waymo car and it arrived. And it was a really interesting experience. First few seconds are sort of, oh, I don't like this. What is it doing? The steering wheel's moving. Who's driving this thing? But then your brain kicks in and says, but hang on, I'd easily get in a car with a human driver who I've never met before, and I don't know how good they are, how I can trust them, whatever. So the car seems to be doing quite well, actually. So then the next day, I did need to get from A to B, and rather than summoning a Waymo, I used an ordinary Uber driver. And the driver turned up with a crack all across the windscreen, bit of a red light there, where the Waymo car was beautifully maintained. And the driver, when we were at a stoplight, he just sort of, the car started creeping forward. And he then stamped on the brake and said, oh, I must have zoned out there. I know, okay, can I have my robot back, please? I felt a lot safer with the robot than I did with the human driver and in that experience. So I think that the world is changing. I guess perhaps that's where we kind of sum up and end, isn't it? The world definitely is changing very fast. For me, it's a worry that we don't have enough regulation and enough direction coming from policymakers around the world to control where the power goes, and that we are letting capitalism shift a huge amount of power into the hands of that tiny number of people and organizations. And I think there's a better way to balance, yes, being very innovative, very creative, but at the same time, having the framework that says what's good for society, where do we as humans want to end up, and helping to shape that where we go rather than just let it happen by accident.
It made me think about many things, these examples, uh, really that I will keep thinking about. But one thing is indeed there is also kind of a shift of power here because of the responsibility of when you ask somebody else or just the vehicle, the AI to move you from point A to B. Is it a human or do you shift this to a robot? Basically,
Yeah.
this power and responsibility in some sense, even if
Mm.
the responsibility we can discuss is it the robot, is it the company, but I suspect indeed that the world will change, and I'm not surprised that's what also you witness also with how we perceive AI generated content. So for the
Mm.
moment, for example, it tends to affect the trust when you see that it's AI generated from the people who perceive this, in particular, if it's not like well explained that it's from a generative AI or AI. And but for these means of transportation as well, I guess we'll have to experiment. And it's
Yeah.
also down to a perception of risks and control. I
Yeah.
guess you might feel that it's probably, if I just think, easier for me to say to the driver, stop, okay, I don't trust you, I want to get out now. And can I do this with a robot? I don't know
Yeah.
how it works. I don't know
Yeah.
the limits. I don't
Yeah.
know, I cannot tap the shoulder and say, hey, be careful about this. How it
Yeah.
will react if I see a danger. Will it take into account my voice? And basically you have this whole world where of uncertainty and humans are imperfect, AI is imperfect, you have different type of risk. You have more also with humans. I guess it's more the realm that we understand now. You see someone who's
Mm.
completely drunk, you understand that there is a risk if they take the wheel. But a robot, you have all these situation with the road with edge cases, right? It's sometimes it has not been well exposed to some situation. It will answer in a completely wrong way, and this is way harder to anticipate. So
Mm.
then you have also this risk aversion. Do you? Do you prefer something that is risky, but you understand slightly better the risk, or you are more used to this, or something else that might be safer on average, but you have no clue when it might mess up? And
Yeah.
honestly, I'm just sharing and thinking out loud, and I will keep
Yes.
thinking about these things. But that's definitely the thing that resonates when you share this
Yeah.
very interesting example.
That is exactly the point. We don't know what the future looks like. It will be very different. We are experimenting with society, we're experimenting with our world. And you and I want that to be done in a safe and controlled way rather than it simply being done by whoever can grab the most money, then making the decisions about what they think is safe for us. So I want all of us as citizens of the world to be able to participate in that discussion. So we need to keep pushing to make that happen.
What would be, just to close, what would be your advice to leader if you have a short advice if they want to implement things in a more responsible way where they don't delegate the power elsewhere? What would be your advice?
Yeah, so I have an 8-step program of responsible AI and good AI governance. So it's about committing to understanding what responsible AI looks like, committing to a framework and making that work in your organization. And then simple things like have an inventory, understand where AI is in your organization, whether it's something you created yourselves or more likely it's hidden inside a third party tool. Think about the stakeholders in the organization and outside, who actually gets involved, who gets to say about how you're using AI, and communicate what you're doing, be transparent, explain what you're doing, and crucially, evaluate these tools so you understand the difference that they're making, not just to your bottom line, but to wider society too.